Let's get into the story. The Clement residence sat in one of the quieter corners of Guarimpa, Abuja, an elegant duplex that exuded wealth and taste from the outside. But within its walls, Ruth Clement lived a reality that starkly contrasted the calm exterior. She was 27, soft-spoken, graceful, and deeply rooted in Christian values. Orphaned at 18, she had grown up under the strict care of her aunt, Mama Gloria, who had arranged her marriage to David Clement, the son of her late best friend, as a supposed blessing. But the wedding hadn't been born of love. It was born of an old promise, an agreement Ruth had little say in. David, who had recently returned from the UK and was rising fast in his corporate career, had resisted the idea of marrying a local girl he didn't choose. But his late father's will had stipulated the union as a condition for inheriting key shares in the family company. So he agreed, but not with his heart. From the moment Ruth moved into the house as David's wife, the temperature between them remained sub-zero. David barely spoke to her unless necessary, and when he did, it was with a clipped tone that made her feel more like an unwelcome guest than a spouse. He never shared meals with her, never asked how she was adjusting, and certainly never touched her with affection. The master bedroom, though large and filled with luxurious furnishings, was divided emotionally by an invisible wall. Ruth tried everything, waking early to make his breakfast, leaving thoughtful notes, dressing in ways she hoped he would like. She enrolled in home management classes, tried new recipes, and even prayed for him daily, believing that one day her sacrifices would soften his heart. But David had already built emotional fortresses that she couldn't enter. He would come home late, lock himself in the study, or disappear for weekends without offering explanations. He left her in a house filled with beauty but devoid of warmth. The neighbors often smiled and nodded when they saw them together in church or at family functions, assuming theirs was a blessed union. But Ruth carried the ache of rejection beneath every ghillie and wrapper she wore. Her attempts to initiate conversation were met with silence or passive dismissals. The night she told him she was pregnant, hoping it might stir some excitement, he stared blankly at her and muttered, "I hope the child isn't as much of a burden as this marriage." Ruth had no voice to respond. She simply held her growing belly and walked away, blinking back tears. In that moment, she knew that this wasn't just a cold season, it was the climate of her marriage. Still, she stayed. Not out of fear, but out of the quiet belief that love could grow where it hadn't been planted yet. That one day, he might see her. Understand her. Want her. But David Clement had no such intentions. His heart belonged somewhere else, or perhaps, it never belonged to her at all. The afternoon sun scorched through the window panes of the overcrowded public hospital and was as Ruth lay on the narrow delivery bed, clutching the sheets with one hand and her swollen belly with the other. The screams of other laboring women filled the corridor, mixing with the sharp scent of antiseptics and sweat. There was no husband pacing in the waiting area, no family member offering support, just Ruth, alone and breathless, as another wave of contraction tore through her body. The nurse, barely able to hide her frustration from being short-staffed, urged her to push. And push she did, with tears streaming down her face, tears not just from pain, but from the ache of abandonment. In the final moment, as her daughter's first cry pierced the room, Ruth cried louder, not in triumph but in sorrow. There was no David to cut the cord. No proud father to kiss her forehead. Only the nurse, tired but kind, who placed the tiny newborn on her chest and whispered, "She's beautiful." "What's her name?" "Deborah," Ruth whispered hoarsely, stroking the infant's fragile cheek. "Her name is Deborah." The name had been on her heart since she was 5 months pregnant, a name that meant be in Hebrew, but to her, it meant strength. Resilience. Life that pushed through sorrow. While Ruth held her daughter and rocked her gently, across town David was clinking glasses with 2 of his business associates at a rooftop lounge in Maitama. The celebration had nothing to do with the birth of his child, it was Sharon's birthday. The woman he openly adored, the one who brought laughter to his lips and fire to his nights. Sharon wore a silk red dress and perched comfortably on David's lap as he poured her another drink, oblivious to the fact that Ruth had been in labor for hours. When his phone buzzed with a text from the hospital nurse, "Your wife has delivered a baby girl. Mother and child are stable," he scoffed and slid the phone back into his jacket. "It's done," he muttered. "Now I can finally move on." Ruth spent 3 days at the hospital recovering. Her bills were paid with borrowed money from a church welfare group because David never showed up, not once. She left the hospital with Deborah wrapped in a thin blanket, cradled to her chest as she boarded a crowded Kiki Napep to Guarimpa. There was no welcome home party. No nursery waiting for the baby. Only silence. When she reached their home, she found David in the living room, sipping whiskey with Sharon beside him, legs crossed, smiling wickedly. He didn't even look up when Ruth walked past with the baby. "Don't expect me to play daddy," he said flatly, flipping the channel. Ruth paused, staring at him, hoping he'd change his mind once he saw the child's face. But he never looked. That night, as she nursed Deborah alone in the guest room, Ruth realized her daughter's existence would never be enough to melt the ice in David Clement's heart. The conference hall at the Lagos Continental Hotel buzzed with luxury and power. Men in tailored suits and women in designer gowns filled the expansive space, glasses of champagne in hand as conversations floated across industries, oil, banking, tech, and real estate. David Clement stood near the center of it all, a rising star in the tech finance sector, known for his sharp mind and sharper tongue. He had been invited as a guest speaker on investment risk strategies, a role that fed his ego more than his purpose. As the panel discussion wrapped up and the crowd shifted toward networking, his eyes caught a woman across the room, tall, commanding, dark-skinned with smooth curves that melted effortlessly into a form-fitting navy gown. Her confidence wasn't loud, but it was impossible to ignore. While others giggled to get noticed, she only glanced in David's direction once, long enough to anchor his attention like a hook to the chest. Her name, he would later learn, was Sharon Idoko. Sharon had the kind of presence that silenced rooms. A marketing executive at a top PR firm in Victoria Island, she was known for making men fall over themselves while she maintained just enough distance to remain in control. When David approached her that night, his usual smug lines failed to land the way they usually did. Sharon wasn't impressed by titles or status, she was impressed by dominance. And David's arrogance amused her. They shared wine and laughter in the corner of the balcony, her hands moving like silk across the glass as she spoke about ambition and legacy. She didn't ask about his marriage, and he didn't offer it. To David, this was the beginning of something electrifying. Finally, someone who matched his pace, someone who didn't smell of sacrifice and submission like Ruth, someone who knew her worth and demanded admiration, not pity. Before the night ended, he had slipped her his hotel key, and Sharon took it with a smirk that confirmed what would come next. The affair didn't bloom in secrecy. It burst into life like a flame on dry leaves. Within a month, Sharon was showing up at David's office under the guise of business visits, sending expensive food deliveries during lunch breaks, and flaunting branded perfume bottles he left in her name. Ruth noticed, of course, but David no longer cared for discretion. He came home later and later, sometimes with Sharon's lipstick still staining his collar. On weekends, he disappeared completely, claiming business trips that never existed. In truth, he and Sharon were exploring resorts, restaurants, and her newly rented shortlet in Lekki Phase 1, paid for with money he should have been saving for his family. Even his colleagues began to whisper how brazen he had become, how cold toward his wife, how smitten he looked beside this new woman. But David didn't care. In his mind, Ruth was a relic from a life he never wanted. Sharon, however, was the future he now claimed with both hands, unapologetically. The house in Guarimpa, once a symbol of promise and new beginnings, had become a hollow cage. The once glowing chandeliers often sat dark as David stopped recharging the electricity meter, claiming Ruth and Deborah were a waste of energy, literally and figuratively. The refrigerator buzzed weekly on rare days there was power, but it held nothing inside except a half-empty tin of baby cereal and a bottle of paracetamol that Ruth rationed carefully. Deborah, now a year and a half old, had grown pale from repeated infections and poor feeding. She cried often from hunger, and each time Ruth tried to calm her with soft songs, her heart broke a little more. David refused to give money for food, stating coldly, "You wanted the child. You feed her." She reached out to his relatives, but they either ignored her or told her to be patient. "He's a man. He'll come around." When Sharon began visiting the house openly, the last traces of Ruth's dignity were chipped away. She didn't knock. She didn't speak to Ruth. She simply walked in with heels clicking against the tiled floors like she owned the place. She brought her own wines and snacks, which she consumed in front of Deborah's curious eyes without offering even a crumb. On some days, Sharon would lounge in the living room wearing David's shirts, scrolling her phone while Ruth swept or washed. Once, Ruth heard Sharon complain about the stale smell of poverty lingering in the corridors. She was referring to Deborah's diaper, which Ruth had been forced to reuse. David laughed. He laughed hard. "She's just jealous," he said, sipping beer beside Sharon, watching cartoons while his daughter coughed uncontrollably in the next room. Ruth wanted to scream, but there was no sound left inside her that could rival the cruelty she witnessed daily. At night, Ruth wrapped Deborah in old clothes to keep her warm when the cold crept through the unlit house. She had sold her jewelry, her wrapper sets, even her wedding ring to buy baby food and antibiotics from the local chemist. Still, it was never enough. The house no longer felt like hers. Sharon now kept her shoes by the door, her toiletries in the bathroom, and once even left an overnight bag in the master bedroom. David began moving his clothes to that room more permanently. One morning, Ruth walked in and found Sharon sitting at her vanity, applying lipstick, and chuckling at herself in the mirror. "If only mirrors could talk," she muttered. "They'd ask you why you're still here." Ruth said nothing. She picked up Deborah, kissed her warm forehead, and left the room. She had no money, no power, and no peace. But she still had her child. For Ruth, that was reason enough to keep breathing. For now. The first time Sharon stepped into the house with a large suitcase, Ruth thought it was a brief visit. Sharon had smiled sweetly, told Ruth she wanted to help around the house since David was too busy, and she claimed she was concerned about Ruth's exhaustion. Ruth, already worn thin from sleepless nights and unpaid bills, had clung to the possibility that someone, anyone, might be willing to assist, even if that help came from the very woman who had taken her husband's heart. But the suitcase never left. Days passed, then weeks. Sharon's clothes filled the wardrobe. Her perfumes lingered on the curtains. Her food occupied the pantry. And soon enough, she declared openly, "I'm staying here now. David thinks it's for the best. You clearly need guidance." Ruth was too stunned to protest. Her quiet faith had taught her endurance, but this intrusion felt like sacrilege. Still, Sharon made herself comfortable in every corner of the house, hosting friends in the living room, rearranging the furniture, and taking over the kitchen as if she had always belonged. It wasn't long before she gave Ruth daily instructions, phrased like suggestions but laced with contempt. "Mop the kitchen before 10, she'd say. "Wash the bed sheets from my room, and don't forget to scrub the toilet floor properly this time." Ruth obeyed without a word. She had begged David once to intervene, but he only responded with a mocking chuckle. "If you're going to live under my roof without paying rent, you better earn your keep," he said, his arms slung lazily around Sharon's shoulders. Deborah, now two, watched quietly as her mother labored like a servant in her own home, her tiny hands tugging Ruth's wrapper as if asking silently why things felt so wrong. The humiliation reached a boiling point one afternoon when Sharon, sipping Zobo in the lounge, called Ruth to the living room while David sat across, scrolling his phone with a smirk. "You missed a spot while dusting," Sharon said, pointing to a corner of the center table. "Are your eyes as useless as your mouth?" Ruth bit her lip hard and got down on her knees to clean the table. David didn't even glance up. When Ruth finished and stood to leave, Sharon threw a wet cloth at her back. "You forgot this too," she said mockingly. David burst into laughter. "You're too soft on her," he told Sharon, sipping his drink. "Maybe if you yell loud enough, she'll finally hear something useful." That night, Ruth knelt in the dark, praying not for a miracle, but for strength, not to fight, but to survive. Because in that house, her pain had become entertainment. And the people inflicting it no longer wore masks. The day began like any other, with Ruth tying Deborah's worn-out sandals and placing what little she could find, a single dry biscuit, into her daughter's polythene school bag. Deborah was weak, her eyes dull and distant, but she forced a smile as Ruth kissed her forehead and whispered, "Be strong for Mummy, okay?" The 3-year-old nodded quietly, though her body was already crying out for help. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. The last pack of cereal had been finished the week before, and all Ruth could offer now were broken crackers and watery pep. Ruth walked her halfway to the community school before hurrying back to meet Sharon's morning commands: mop the corridor, wash the duvet, scrub the pots. Meanwhile, across town, David was in a conference room with his arm around Sharon, laughing over her marketing pitch while pretending not to see the 32 missed calls from Ruth the day before. It happened just before the noon break. Deborah had stood up to recite her alphabet when her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the tiled floor, trembling and gasping for air. Her teacher, Miss Ean, rushed to her side, horrified at how light the girl felt in her arms. Her uniform hung loosely, like fabric on a broomstick. "Call her mother," she yelled as they rushed Deborah to the school gate. Ruth, drenched in sweat from scrubbing the bathroom, dropped everything when the headmistress's call came through. She sprinted barefoot across 2 streets, arriving to find Deborah unconscious on the school's clinic bed, her small hands twitching slightly. "We have to get her to a real hospital," the nurse urged. Ruth didn't wait to think. She wrapped Deborah in her arms and flagged down a Kiki Napep to the nearest private hospital. She knew public hospitals could delay for hours. She didn't have that time. At Delhi Healthcare, the doctor took one look at Deborah and ordered emergency admission. But at the reception, the nurse stopped Ruth with a firm tone. "Madam, we need a deposit of 75,000 naira before we proceed with full treatment. It's policy." Ruth froze. She opened her purse, barely 500 naira. "Please," she whispered. "She's dying. Just start. I'll find a way." The nurse shook her head. "We'll place her on oxygen, but no tests or medication until payment is made." Deborah was wheeled in on a stretcher as Ruth sat in the hallway, eyes wild with panic, dialing David over and over again. He didn't answer. Her calls to his siblings went unanswered too. The only person who had the money and power to help was deliberately ignoring the cries of his own daughter. And inside the cold white walls of that hospital, time was ticking, slowly, cruelly, against Deborah's fragile heartbeat. The hospital corridor was thick with silence, interrupted only by the hum of machines and the occasional creak of nurses' shoes. Ruth sat on the cold plastic bench, clutching her phone with trembling hands. Her eyes were red from crying, her wrapper soaked in sweat and dust from the mad dash through Abuja's traffic. Deborah lay beyond the swinging white doors, her breathing shallow, her skin pale. Ruth had exhausted every contact in her phone, church members, old school friends, even her estranged cousin in Kaduna, but no one could come up with the urgent 75,000 naira. All that remained was one bitter option. With her heart pounding and dignity already threadbare, Ruth wiped her face and stepped out of the hospital. She flagged a taxi, her voice cracking as she directed the driver back to the Gwarinpa house she once called home. David was on the balcony with Sharon when she arrived, laughing over something on Sharon's phone. He looked down at her with a frown, already irritated. "Why are you here again?" he snapped. "Didn't I tell you to stop showing up uninvited?" Ruth barely noticed Sharon's smirk or the wine glass in her hand. She fell to her knees, right there on the tiled porch, her voice breaking with each word. "Please, David. Deborah is dying. The doctors won't treat her without a deposit. I'll do anything. Anything. Just help us." David stared at her for a moment, then turned to Sharon. "What do you think?" "She says she'll do anything." Sharon laughed softly, swirling her wine. "Let's test that, then. She can clean my room. Wash all the clothes. Scrub the bathroom tiles with a toothbrush. If she wants money, she should work for it like a maid. After all, that's what she is, right?" David raised his glass and chuckled. "Sounds fair." Ruth agreed. She bowed her head, swallowed her pride, and began immediately. She spent the next hours scrubbing Sharon's bathroom with industrial bleach that burned her skin. She hand-washed undergarments and designer dresses with water from a half-filled drum. She cleaned dusty wardrobes and polished Sharon's shoes while Sharon filmed her quietly from the doorway, snickering. "Faster," Sharon barked. "That's not how we wash silk. Don't they teach these things in the village?" Ruth said nothing. Every lash of insult felt like a needle in her chest, but all she saw was Deborah's face, her soft breathing, her tiny fingers, and she pushed on. When she finally finished and approached Sharon with her palm open, heart pounding, Sharon scoffed. "Oh, the money? I changed my mind. I don't think your work was good enough." She turned and walked into David's arms. "She's really pathetic," Sharon whispered. David, still laughing, kissed her forehead and closed the door. Ruth collapsed on the doorstep, her tears hot on the marble floor. She had begged. She had served. And still, her daughter lay in danger, forgotten by the man who helped bring her into the world. The hospital ward was dimly lit, with only the soft beeping of the heart monitor breaking the heavy silence. Ruth sat by Deborah's bedside, gently stroking her daughter's fevered forehead with a damp cloth. Deborah had not opened her eyes in over 24 hours. Her breathing was shallow, her lips dry, and her tiny frame looked more fragile than ever beneath the stiff hospital blanket. Ruth had begged the doctors to continue treatment even without the full deposit, and they had reluctantly administered drips and oxygen to buy her some time. But the warnings were clear: without blood tests and medication, the child wouldn't last much longer. Ruth hadn't eaten in almost 2 days. Her head throbbed with hunger and exhaustion, but she didn't leave Deborah's side. She prayed with every ounce of strength she had left, whispering into her daughter's ears, "Don't leave me, my bee. Please don't leave me." It was close to evening when the door creaked open and David Clement finally appeared, dressed sharply in a designer suit that smelled of expensive cologne. Ruth's eyes lifted with renewed hope, expecting to see concern, maybe even regret. Instead, David looked around the room with visible disgust, waving off the smell of antiseptic. He didn't glance at the machines or the child lying lifeless on the bed. He walked straight to Ruth and dropped a brown envelope into her lap. "Sign these," he said coldly. Ruth blinked in confusion, opening the flap with trembling fingers. The header read "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage." Her heart sank. "David." "Not now," she whispered. "Please, she's not even awake. Can't this wait?" But David scoffed, folding his arms. "I've waited long enough. You and this thing," he gestured toward Deborah without looking, "you're both a burden. A disease. I'm done pretending." Ruth stood, hands shaking as she clutched the papers. "Please, just help us. Sign after. We'll leave. I swear. Just help her." Her voice cracked, desperation surging through every syllable. David smirked. "I've already done more than enough. I married you, didn't I? That was your jackpot. It's over. Sign those, and maybe I'll give you transport fare on the way out." He turned and walked to the door, pausing only to look at the unconscious child. "She stinks like poverty. Just like you." And then he left, without a backward glance, without a care in the world. Ruth sank to her knees, clutching the papers, her cries muffled by the linen blanket as the monitor beside her continued to beep slowly, marking every fragile heartbeat her child still had left. The late afternoon sky hung heavy with gray clouds, casting a somber hue over the city of Abuja. Ruth wandered aimlessly along the edge of the highway, her wrapper dusty and her steps unsure. The world around her moved in motion, cars sped by, horns blared, people rushed, but within her, time had ceased to exist. Her face was streaked with dry tears, her lips cracked, and her eyes empty. She clutched the folded obituary slip the hospital had printed for Deborah's death in one trembling hand. No burial had taken place yet, there was no money. The child's body still lay in the hospital morgue, alone, forgotten by the one man who should have cared. Ruth's sandals had broken hours earlier. She walked barefoot now, the tar scorching her feet. She didn't notice the cars. She didn't care where the road led. She had nothing and no one left in this world. The rumble of a black Prado SUV speeding down the expressway echoed behind her, but Ruth didn't hear it. The driver, swerving slightly to avoid a pothole, never expected a woman to suddenly stagger into the road, arms dangling, her head bowed like a ghost. The screech of brakes tore through the air, and the impact knocked her forward, flipping her onto the median with a dull thud. Traffic slowed instantly. Drivers craned their necks, some shouting, others recording with their phones. The Prado's driver, a middle-aged man in a crisp blue kaftan, jumped out immediately, his face drained of color. "Jesus! Somebody help me," he shouted as he ran toward her, checking for a pulse, waving for his security escort to clear space. "Call LifePoint Hospital now," he barked into his Bluetooth. In the few seconds he held her wrist and stared at her unconscious face, something about her struck him, something haunted and broken. That man was Richard Edwards, billionaire CEO of Edwards Group International and the direct boss of David Clement. Known for his brilliance, discipline, and ruthless leadership, Richard rarely drove himself, but that day, his driver had taken leave unexpectedly, and he decided to handle his errands alone. He had just come from a board meeting, irritated by financial reports, unaware that fate had its own meeting planned for him. As his guards lifted Ruth gently into the vehicle, Richard noticed the torn obituary slip fall from her grip. He picked it up and read the name, Deborah Clement. His eyes narrowed. Clement, he muttered. He had heard that name before, frequently. But there was no time to think. He climbed into the back seat, watching the unconscious woman beside him as the SUV sped toward the hospital. Somewhere in his chest, an unexplainable weight began to form. He didn't know who she was yet. But something told him this was no ordinary accident. The first thing Ruth saw when she opened her eyes was white. Clean, soft white, sheets, curtains, ceiling. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, gentle and calming, so different from the harsh antiseptic she had grown used to in public clinics. A cool breeze filtered through a half-open window, and sunlight danced lightly across the tiled floor. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Her body ached, but not from cold or hunger, just the lingering echo of pain that was slowly fading. Machines beeped steadily beside her. A nurse, dressed in crisp scrubs, appeared at her side with a warm smile. "You're safe, ma'am," she said softly. "You're at LifePoint Private Medical. You were brought here after an accident." Ruth blinked, disoriented. Then the memory flooded back, Deborah's death, the road, the headlights. Her breath caught. Her eyes welled. But the nurse gently squeezed her hand. "He's here," she whispered. "The man who brought you in. He's been waiting." Later that afternoon, Richard Edwards entered the room, his usually stern expression softened by concern. He sat in the chair beside her bed, not with the arrogance of a billionaire, but the quiet attentiveness of someone who truly cared. Ruth, hesitant at first, didn't speak much. But Richard didn't push. He only asked one question, "Can I know your story?" And with trembling lips and a voice still cracked from grief, Ruth told it. She spoke of David, the forced marriage, the betrayal, the humiliation. She told him about Sharon, about scrubbing her own floors while begging for her daughter's life. She described the hospital that demanded deposits while Deborah struggled to breathe, and the moment David handed her divorce papers beside their dying child. She didn't dramatize it. She simply told the truth. And Richard listened, every word, every pause, every tear. He never interrupted. When she finished, she turned her face to the wall, expecting silence. But Richard spoke firmly. "No one will ever treat you like that again. Not while I'm breathing." From that moment on, Ruth's healing became sacred to him. He moved her to a private wing, arranged for round-the-clock medical care, and ensured she lacked nothing. Nutritionists prepared her meals. Therapists visited discreetly. Clean clothes, warm baths, a soft bed, comforts she hadn't known in years, became her new reality. When she tried to protest, to say it was too much, he simply said, "You deserve to be treated like a human being again, Ruth. Like the queen you've always been." For the first time in her life, she wasn't surviving, she was being restored. Not with pity, but with honor. And as she lay in that sunlit room, watching flowers bloom outside the window, Ruth allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't ending in sorrow, but beginning anew. The Edwards Group boardroom on the 11th floor of the company's headquarters was known for two things: its stunning view of Abuja's skyline and its unforgiving atmosphere during executive sessions. On this particular Monday morning, Richard Edwards sat at the head of the long polished mahogany table, his expression unreadable as a team of internal auditors presented their findings. It had been 2 weeks since Ruth's accident and quiet recovery. Richard had paid for her treatment in full and arranged for her to stay in a private villa under medical observation. She hadn't spoken much, but what little she had shared stirred something deep in him, a blend of pity, anger, and resolve. Her mention of a man named David Clement, followed by the heartbreaking details of a daughter lost, had sent Richard into silent overdrive. As CEO of a conglomerate with zero tolerance for personal or professional misconduct, Richard had quietly begun an investigation, not just out of curiosity, but out of a growing desire to uncover truth. What he found was worse than expected. David had been siphoning money from the marketing budget, disguised invoices, padded contracts, and offshore transfers that didn't align with company records. And it didn't stop there. Sharon Idoko, who had once served briefly as a contracted PR consultant, was also named on the company payroll as a wellness strategist, though no one could recall seeing her in the office. Her monthly allowances were unusually high, matched with multiple expense reports signed off by David alone. The finance team had overlooked the irregularities due to David's reputation as a top performer. But Richard saw the truth now. The same man who had dismissed a dying child and discarded a loyal wife had also been stealing from the company he swore to protect. Richard folded the file and dismissed the team with a curt nod. As they filed out, he remained behind, staring out the window, one hand resting on the folder that contained David's undoing. The timing, he decided, had to be perfect. 3 days later, invitations were sent across departments, an exclusive gala night at the Edwards Towers Grand Hall, celebrating employee excellence and innovation. It was a lavish affair, the kind where reputations were solidified and futures made. David received his invitation with pride, assuming it was recognition for his recent achievements. He shared the news with Sharon excitedly, who immediately began planning her outfit. Neither of them had the faintest idea that the guest of honor, the woman whose name was written in gold at the bottom of the event program, was Ruth Clement. Richard had personally arranged for her gown, makeup, and transportation. She would not walk in as a beggar or a widow. She would walk in as a woman who had survived hell and was finally being seen. Richard watched the staff prepare for the event, his heart firm with purpose. The stage was set. The truth was ready to speak. And David's carefully curated world was about to crumble, under lights, music, and the weight of his own betrayal. The buzz around Edwards Group grew louder by the hour. Emails flooded inboxes, posters lined the corridors, and whispers swirled through break rooms like wildfire. The annual corporate gala, normally a formal celebration of milestones and performance, had taken on an air of mystery. The invitation was elegant, deep blue with gold embossing, and bore a single line beneath the time and venue: "Prepare for an unforgettable night." It was signed personally by Richard Edwards. Staff speculated wildly. Some believed the CEO would announce a merger. Others predicted he might step down or unveil a surprise bonus scheme. But none suspected the truth, that this year's gala had one hidden purpose: justice. David Clement, ever confident and eager to climb higher, was among the first to RSVP. He strutted through the halls, boasting to colleagues about his upcoming speech, already assuming he'd received the top strategist award. "Richard can't deny results," he said to a junior analyst. "Our figures tripled under my leadership." Sharon, equally enthusiastic, visited a high-end boutique and was to shop for a gold dress with exaggerated sleeves and matching heels. "Everyone will see who's running this company behind the scenes," she whispered as the tailor took her measurements. They didn't know Richard was watching from afar. He saw the RSVP list, the designer receipts processed through the company's credit account in David's name, and even the personal note Sharon sent to the event planner requesting a reserved front-row table. The arrogance wasn't just visible, it was staggering. Meanwhile, in a quiet, private wing of the Edwards estate, Ruth sat before a full-length mirror, her reflection barely recognizable. Her skin had regained some glow, her frame stronger now from proper nutrition and rest. A stylist adjusted the fabric of a royal purple gown commissioned specifically for her, custom fit, hand-stitched, elegant. Richard had spared no expense, not for glamour, but for dignity. She wasn't just attending the gala. She was the guest of honor. Her name was to be revealed last, just as Richard would ascend the stage. No one knew her face, most of the staff had never seen her before, but Richard wanted her reintroduction to be unforgettable. Ruth clutched her purse tightly, her breath shallow. She didn't crave attention. But tonight, she would not sit in shadows. She would be seen, not as a victim, but as the silent storm that had weathered betrayal and lived to rise again. The Edwards Towers Grand Hall glittered with gold drapes and crystal chandeliers, a reflection of the opulence that defined Richard Edwards' empire. The gala was in full swing, wine glasses clinked, a jazz band played softly in the corner, and executives in sleek tuxedos mingled with department heads and rising stars. David Clement sat at the front with Sharon, dressed in his finest black velvet suit, grinning as cameras flashed and colleagues offered handshakes. Sharon, radiant in a shimmering gold gown, whispered confidently, "I can already see our photo on the next company magazine cover." David smirked, tapping his fingers on the table. After tonight, Richard will have no choice but to recognize who runs the future of this company. The crowd slowly quieted as the lights dimmed and Richard Edwards stepped onto the stage, dressed sharply in a navy blue agbada. The projector behind him flashed images of company achievements, innovation statistics, and global outreach. Polite applause followed. Then Richard's tone shifted. "Tonight is not just about celebrating our accomplishments," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "It's also a night of accountability." The room stiffened. Richard turned to face the audience directly. "We pride ourselves on integrity. But recently, I discovered breaches within this organization, fraud, abuse of trust, and actions unbefitting of anyone associated with this brand." Whispers erupted in the crowd. Richard held up a file. "David Clement," he said slowly, "has siphoned company funds, manipulated financial documents, and enabled the fraudulent employment of an unqualified individual under the guise of consultancy." David's smile vanished. Sharon's jaw dropped. The room fell into stunned silence. A security officer emerged from the wings of the stage. "You're fired," Richard declared, his voice echoing. "Effective immediately. All access revoked. Legal charges will follow." A gasp shot through the hall like lightning. David stood abruptly, flustered, his voice cracking. "Richard, sir, this can't be." Sharon grabbed his arm, but her face turned white as a photo of her payroll documents appeared on the projector. Laughter rippled through the audience, uneasy, awkward. "And for Miss Sharon Idoko," Richard continued coolly, "your employment scam ends here. This is a company of merit, not favors." Sharon stumbled backward, heels clicking violently on the marble floor as people turned to stare. David's world had crumbled in seconds. No exit speech. No handshake. Just disgrace, served under 1,000 eyes and the unblinking stare of the woman watching silently from the rear of the hall, Ruth. Draped in purple, regal and unmoved, she didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply watched justice unfold like the very breath of heaven answering her pain. The night air in Abuja was thick with shame as David stumbled into his estate in Gwarinpa, his blazer half slid off his shoulder, his tie yanked loose around his neck like a noose. The echoes of Richard's words still clanged in his ears. "You're fired. Legal charges. Effective immediately." His palms trembled as he opened the gate, but worse than the loss of power was the laughter, the knowing smirks from neighbors standing outside with folded arms, their whispers loud enough for him to hear. "It don't happen," one of them muttered. "Pride go before fall." David had lived here like a king, refusing to greet anyone, barking at security men like they were beneath him. Now, the same men watched him stumble in humiliation. His own gateman hesitated before opening the door. "Oga, welcome," he said awkwardly, unsure whether to show pity or distance. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. Sharon's gold heels were gone from the doorway. The scent of her perfume was still faint in the air, like a mocking reminder of her presence. David dropped his phone on the glass table and opened his laptop, his savings, investments, offshore accounts. Panic swept through him as he stared at the screen. Everything had been wiped clean. The passwords were changed. The alerts on his phone began to ping with banking notifications. Transaction alert, $10,000 transferred. $25,000 withdrawal approved. Final balance, $462. David's breath caught in his throat. "No. No. And oh," he shouted, throwing the laptop across the room. It smashed into the wall and fell in silence. He grabbed his phone and dialed Sharon repeatedly. Switched off. Again. Number not reachable. He opened Instagram, her account was deleted. His email? Blocked. It dawned on him then, Sharon had planned this. She had used his name, drained his wealth, and vanished like vapor. By morning, news of his downfall had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Neighbors who once waved politely now snickered behind curtains. One woman, Mama Ifeoma, muttered, "He chased his wife out for Jezebel. Now look at him." David stood at the front gate in yesterday's clothes, his phone dead, his wallet empty. His staff had resigned via text. His car was on the verge of repossession. His life, once wrapped in control, charm, and arrogance, was unraveling fast. And Sharon? She was already sipping cocktails in Dubai, posting under a new alias, her smile wide and untouched by the ruins she left behind. David finally sat on the cold pavement outside his once proud mansion, head bowed, heart racing with a kind of loneliness he'd never known. No job. No money. No allies. And worst of all, no one left to call. In just a matter of days, David Clement's world collapsed beyond recognition. Once chauffeured in a black Benz and escorted into boardrooms like royalty, he now walked Abuja's streets in borrowed slippers and a faded shirt with a frayed collar. His estate gate was locked permanently, his house repossessed by the bank, his cars towed for auction, and his accounts frozen pending legal action from Edwards Group. His name was stripped from company directories and his ID blacklisted. Every attempt to secure a job was met with rejection. Calls to old colleagues went unanswered. Some blocked his number entirely. "You embarrassed us all," one finally texted. "Stay far away." Even relatives who once basked in his wealth now claimed they were traveling or unreachable when he came knocking. David was no longer the rising star, he was a cautionary tale, a walking symbol of squandered grace. With nowhere else to turn, he swallowed his shame and decided to find Ruth. Not out of love, not even out of remorse at first, but out of desperation. He heard whispers from a former coworker that Ruth had survived the accident and was now staying in a private estate owned by Richard Edwards himself. David laughed bitterly at the irony. The same woman he discarded now under the care of the man he had once called soft. With his last borrowed airtime, he called a Kiki and gave them the address he had pieced together. The estate was in Maitama, lined with black SUVs and tall gates with rotating security. As he approached on foot, dust clinging to his feet and sweat pouring from his brow, the guards took one look at him and raised their walkie-talkies. "We've got a man at the gate. Name, David Clement. He says he's here for Ruth." Within seconds, a black-suited security head appeared. "Turn around," the man said firmly, no emotion in his tone. "She doesn't want to see you." David stepped forward, his voice breaking. Please just let me explain. Let me say something." "She's my wife," she was, the man corrected him, raising a hand to his earpiece. "And she asked not to be disturbed. You need to leave. Now." David's knees nearly buckled, but the look on the guard's face made it clear there would be no second warning. He turned slowly, eyes burning. Behind the tall iron gates, he thought he saw a silhouette watching from a window, but he couldn't be sure. With nothing left but regret and a body weak from hunger, David walked away from the one place he had once owned, the heart he never valued, now forever out of reach. The sun filtered gently through the glass-paneled roof of the newly opened Daughters of Grace Initiative, a non-profit organization under the Richard Edwards Foundation. The office was quiet but vibrant, its walls painted in calming earth tones and lined with framed photos of women smiling in workshops, holding certificates, or planting gardens. In one of the modest but well-furnished offices, Ruth sat behind a desk, gently flipping through intake forms for newly registered survivors. She was no longer the woman who walked barefoot on the highway with grief carved into her bones. Though her pain hadn't vanished, it had transformed into fuel, into resolve, into purpose. Her days were now filled with counseling women who had endured versions of what she had survived: neglect, emotional torture, financial manipulation, and abandonment. And each time she heard a story that mirrored hers, she didn't just sympathize. She understood. Richard had offered her the position personally, not as charity, but as a recognition of her strength and insight. Ruth started as a volunteer, then quickly transitioned into a full-time coordinator, overseeing outreach programs to shelters and hosting intimate support circles. Survivors opened up to her not because of credentials, but because of her warmth and raw honesty. She shared bits of her journey, not for pity, but to show healing was possible. "I was once broken too," she often told them. "But I found breath again." With every passing week, Ruth's shoulders straightened, her voice grew stronger, and her laughter, once a memory, began to return in soft echoes through the halls. The staff respected her deeply, not just for her compassion, but for her quiet resilience. She wasn't just doing a job. She was building a legacy from ruins. Outside the NGO's gate, women lined up every morning, some with babies tied to their backs, others with bruised hearts hidden under makeup and silence. Ruth welcomed each one like a sister. She organized food drives, job skill workshops, and shelter placements, working long hours without complaint. It gave her purpose. It gave her peace. And in those quiet moments, like when a young mother hugged her tightly after receiving a sewing machine, or when a girl read aloud for the first time, Ruth felt something she hadn't in years: fulfillment. The kind of joy that doesn't roar, but rests in the soul like warm light. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, it wasn't cloaked in fear. It was hers. Entirely hers. And that made all the difference. The letter came folded in a worn, crumpled envelope with Ruth's name scrawled across the front in shaky handwriting. It had no return address, but the scent of regret clung to it before she even opened it. The receptionist at Daughters of Grace Initiative had received it from a delivery boy who said only, "A man asked me to drop this. Said she'd know who it's from." Ruth recognized the handwriting instantly: David's. For a long while, she simply stared at it, unmoving, as if the paper might dissolve under her gaze. It was the first time he had reached out since being turned away at the estate gates weeks ago. The envelope trembled slightly in her hands as she carried it into her small office, closed the door gently behind her, and sat down at her desk, alone with the past once more. She unfolded the paper slowly, her eyes scanning the jagged ink strokes. David's words were raw, frantic in places, almost incoherent in others. He spoke of his downfall, of waking up on a cold church bench with nothing but coins in his pocket and no one to call. He described Sharon's betrayal, how she emptied his life and bank account in one calculated move. He wrote of dreams that now haunted him, dreams where Deborah called out for water, for food, for her mother, and he couldn't answer. "I don't sleep, Ruth," the letter read. "I see her every night. Her eyes. Her silence. I failed you. I failed her. I've lost everything, and it's what I deserve. But if there's even a sliver of space in your heart, forgive me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The ink smudged at the bottom as though written through tears. But Ruth didn't cry. Her face remained calm, her fingers steady. When she finished reading, she folded the letter in half, then in quarters. She stood from her desk, walked out to the small garden behind the NGO office, and without a word, struck a match. The paper caught flame quickly, curling at the edges, blackening until only ashes floated down into the flower bed. Ruth stood watching it burn until the last ember died. No words passed her lips. No sigh escaped her chest. She simply turned, her face unreadable, and walked back into the building. She did not need vengeance. She did not need apologies. Some wounds could not be undone with ink and paper. Some betrayals were too deep for redemption. And Ruth had learned, her silence carried more power now than any reply ever could. The waves whispered along the shore, gentle and unhurried as they caressed the warm sands of Elagushi Beach under a golden Lagos sunset. The sky was painted in soft hues of orange and lavender, casting a serene glow over the private cove Richard Edwards had reserved for the evening. There were no photographers, no grand gestures, no crowd, just 2 chairs, a picnic blanket, a basket of her favorite local pastries, and the steady rhythm of the sea. Ruth stood barefoot at the edge of the water, her white sundress fluttering in the breeze, arms folded loosely as she stared into the horizon. She had been invited under the pretense of an informal board retreat. But the look in Richard's eyes when he asked her to come alone had told her this would be more than a business conversation. Richard walked toward her, silent at first, his brown loafers kicking up sand. He held no box, no ring in hand, just presence, the kind that made her feel seen without being stared at. "You remind me of the sea," he said softly, standing beside her. Quiet, deep, but powerful. Ruth smiled faintly, but her eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "I wasn't always like this," she whispered. "I used to be afraid of everything. Of losing. Of being invisible." Richard nodded. "And now?" She turned to him slowly. "Now, I'm afraid of being loved. And losing that too." He said nothing for a moment, then reached into his pocket, not for a ring, but for a small, folded paper. On it were handwritten words. "I wrote this a few days ago. Not promises. Not poetry. Just truths," he said. "You don't owe me an answer today. But I needed you to know, this isn't about rescuing you. It's about walking beside someone I deeply admire. They sat together, cross-legged on the blanket, as Ruth read the letter. It spoke of admiration, of respect, of a love that asked nothing and offered everything. She was quiet for a long time after, the waves providing the only music between them. Then she exhaled, a deep, freeing breath, and met his gaze. "I've lived in shadows for so long, I forgot what warmth felt like," she said. "But you've never tried to force light into my life. You just held the lantern, waiting." Her eyes welled, but this time, the tears were soft. "Healing. Yes, Richard. I'll walk with you." He reached for her hand, no grand applause, no flash of rings. Just the joining of fingers under a setting sun, two survivors choosing peace over pain, hope over history. The gardens of the Edwards estate were transformed into a vision of understated elegance. Rows of cream and gold chairs flanked an aisle lined with white hibiscus petals, leading to a simple wooden altar draped in flowing ivory fabric. The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh roses, and the low hum of a string quartet blended with the quiet awe of the guests. It wasn't a publicized affair. There were no press releases, no influencer live streams, no social media hashtags. This wedding wasn't about spectacle. It was about a woman who had been broken, buried, and resurrected by grace, and a man who had seen her worth when the world saw weakness. Ruth stood behind a white curtain, her dress simple but regal, her hair adorned with a delicate gold comb, her heart beating slowly, steadily. She had asked for no veil. "I've hidden long enough," she had said. "Let me walk forward uncovered, unafraid." As she stepped into the garden, every guest rose. The small crowd consisted of staff from Daughters of Grace Initiative, close friends of Richard, and a few women Ruth had helped through the organization, women who now wore smiles where bruises used to be. Richard stood waiting at the altar, his agbada spotless, his eyes misted with pride. When she reached him, he didn't speak right away. He just took her hands, kissed her fingers, and smiled, full of peace. The officiant began, but the vows were spoken softly, like secrets exchanged between two souls who had weathered the worst of storms. There were no loud declarations. No exaggerated gestures. Just two people choosing each other in full awareness of where they had come from, and where they were going together. Across the city, David Clement stood outside a roadside buka, watching the TV through a window. The evening news showed a still image from the Edwards Foundation newsletter, Richard and Ruth, hand in hand at the wedding altar. No one else in the buka recognized her. But David did. He clutched the bottle of cheap water in his hand, fingers tightening. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt. He had heard whispers, of course, about a powerful woman working behind the scenes at the foundation, but he never imagined it was her. Not like this. A woman once discarded as useless now married to the very man he had once envied. He walked away from the screen, unnoticed and uninvited, swallowed by the noise of the street. In the garden, Ruth and Richard shared their first dance beneath string lights and a soft sky. There were no ghosts left to haunt her. Only grace. Only joy. And peace, finally, fully, was hers. That's the end of the story. What did you learn about the story? Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Thanks for watching.